I want to welcome everybody. I'm Jeb Middlebrook in the Sociology department at Cal State Dominguez Hills. The panel here, Oliver John Baptiste, a master's student in Sociology at Dominguez Hills as well, and Corina, a master's student at Sociology in Dominguez Hills. We're really excited about this opportunity, and we decided to do a roundtable as opposed to a strict reading of papers. So what it's going to involve briefly is a short, maybe 8 to 10 minute bringing together from each scholar about the work that they're currently doing. And then we're really interested in a really collaborative and open conversation among the three of us about these themes of evictions, homelessness, and imprisonment that reflects our different work. This is Corina's talk later. This is the overall panel. And we're really interested in a collective conversation on the intersecting politics, aesthetics, considerations of themes of race and space. And we found that in working together in our department and being familiar with each other's work, we thought, oh, these are interesting themes that run through our work. So let's see what happens when we put them together and open up a conversation. So we'll do that, and then we'll have a considerable amount of time to open up a dialogue with all of you as well. I'm taking responsibility for helping to facilitate that conversation, but we definitely encourage notes, ideas, critical considerations, however it moves you. So before we start, I just wanted to offer a special acknowledgement and thanks to the Title V PPOA-HA program and PEGS, which is a program at Dominguez Hills called Promoting Excellence in Graduate Studies that helps supply the funding to get us here. Driving up and staying, as well as the support for registration. It really made the roundtable possible. We'll start then with Oliver's paper. And I want to give a little more formal bio. So Oliver John Baptiste, as I mentioned, is a master's student in sociology at Dominguez Hills. He earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from CSU Long Beach. He has interests in research involving housing, historical sociology, as well as literary theory. Oliver also works as an education coordinator for one of the largest nonprofit housing organizations in Southern California. And he provides counseling and training to property owners, realtors, and managers. You see some intersections between his personal work and his research work. His background in the rental housing industry has fueled his interest in the intersections between economics, law, and housing issues, as well as the social and political implications of public policy. So the title of his talk today, you see here, Factoring Socioeconomics in Court-Documented Eviction History, Rental Sustainability in the New Market. Oliver.
Good morning, everyone. Now, my current research is discussing housing evictions or residential evictions occurring in the Los Angeles County area. Now, most of you hopefully have never experienced an eviction, but you pretty much know what it involves or anything. Now, in my study or anything, I found intersections between demographics, who are the new renters out there, anything, who is this new growing population of renters, and also what are some of the topics that are involving that everything in terms of affordable housing, vacancy rates, and so forth, and also how do certain pressures affect certain groups in terms of maintaining housing and also actually getting it in the first place. Now, my data comes from credit reports. These are tenant screening reports requested by property owners. Property owners and managers request these reports and are used as a decision-making tool whether to reject or accept someone. Now, 2011 or anything was a very seminal year for the rental housing industry. The rental housing industry produced $1.1 trillion to the U.S. economy. At the same time, it supported 25.7 million jobs. That was just in 2011, quite a significant growth for the rental housing industry. At the same time, the renter population increased by 1 million applicants. So again, we see this blossoming just within 1 year. Now, I specifically picked 2011 because it was a very seminal year for the growth in the industry, but again, this trend has been continuing for the past 4 or 5 years. Now, this term has been associated with what's been called the renter society. The renter society is a term that you might have heard some politicians bring up. It's bandied about it within the industry. And basically, it represents the expectation or the prediction that in the coming years, more Americans will choose to rent over purchasing a home, largely to avoid the cost of a mortgage and, of course, the maintenance costs associated with owning a property. Now, the rise of the rental society or everything, has put a downward pressure on the availability of housing and also on vacancy rates. So again, the availability of housing and vacancy rates are two things affected by this growth of the housing industry. Now, vacancy rates describe the supply side of the rental housing industry, and there's something called the accounting income approach of a 5% vacancy rate. A 5% vacancy rate is used throughout the entire industry. For example, once vacancies go below 5%, that means that there's insufficient housing, greater competition among tenants, and of course, higher rent rates. Once vacancy rates go above 5%, there is ample housing, much more competition between landlords, and of course, lower rents. Now, Reed's market research reported that in 2012, the nationwide vacancy rate was at 4.9%. Bringing it closer to home, Los Angeles County, we're currently at 4.3%. And again, this trend has been throughout urban communities throughout this nation and everything. There was a survey done by the Center for Housing Research by Harvard University, and looking at 75 largest metropolitan cities throughout this nation, I found vacancy rates continually declining throughout the nation. So again, we have a blossoming of this population, the renter society, putting a downward pressure on available housing and also on vacancy rates. Now, much of the growth of this renter society has come from minorities, women, as well as the young. For example, younger minorities tend to be, less likely to own a home in the United States. For example, in 2011, 30% of all households were owned by minorities. 46% or anything of them were renters. Now, many of these households are struggling to pay their rents and their mortgage. For example, the American Community Survey reported 42 million households, or 37%, paying more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. We also have 18% paying more than half of their income on monthly housing. That's considered a severe burden. And between 2001 and 2012 or anything, that number has increased by 6.4%. So again, we have over a decade or anything of people paying more than half of their monthly income for housing. Now, whether you're looking at studies on evictions, whether they're studying populations of 500,000 or more, or large metropolitan areas of 2 million individuals, we consistently find that minorities, the young and women are disproportionately affected by evictions. And in many cases, it's not uncommon to see that on the lease, on the rental agreement, you're going to see a female name. Most of these females, for example, maybe their significant other has a criminal record or credit, and a variety of reasons or anything, but you're likely going to see females on the lease agreement. So if the American rental population has grown significantly in the past 10 years, and if most of these renters are going to be racial minorities and women and so forth, evictions will become a very central problem along with affordable housing and available housing in the coming years. Now, as I mentioned, my research comes from tenant screening reports or credit reports. These are credit reports that have evictions on record. I looked at 500 credit reports coming from the Los Angeles County area. Now, Los Angeles County in 2012 had a 52% renter occupied on tenure rates. That means over half of the population in Los Angeles County are renters. Now, my study looks at the demographic characteristics of these renters with evictions, their financial standing based on their debt and their payment for rents, as well as the outcome of the eviction itself. What was the nature of the eviction that they were involved in? How did it turn out? What was the judgment? Who took it in the courts? And what prompted this eviction in the first place? Now, although these evictions were drawn between the years of 2012 and 2013, evictions go back as far as 2008 to 2013. So again, a pretty wide range of evictions during these years. Now, I guess some simple facts from that data. 58% of the applicants were women. And I wasn't surprised or anything. On average or anything, you're going to have mostly women or anything, who are leaseholders on contract. Now, 71% of these applicants were between the ages of 30 and 53. And what's pretty interesting, it's kind of a bell curve pattern in terms of the age distribution of the applicants. When you're about 25 and younger, the rate of eviction is about 8%. Once you're about 55 and over, the rate of eviction is about 14%. But that kind of meaty middle period between 30 and 54 and anything, disproportionately, most of the evictions or anything are in that area. And again, it really shows the fact that evictions are not necessarily a poor problem, not necessarily something that happens to people with lots of debt, but it's really found throughout the age spectrum. Now, slightly under a quarter, about 22% of these applicants were former homeowners. And you find a trend where a lot of people who were former homeowners now coming back into the rental housing industry. Many of them were unfortunately victims who bought into subprime loans, and they were homeowners for a short period of time. Not only do you have many individuals like myself who are now becoming renters, you have people who were homeowners now choosing to rent or anything, even enlarging the rental population much more. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get the amount of rent that these applicants are paying for their monthly rent rates or anything. But I could find the number of bedrooms for the properties where the evictions took place. Now, on average, I found that 54% of the applicants were paid about $1,400 to $2,300 a month on rent. Now, these are HUD fair market rates. It's much higher than what's called the asking rent amount. The asking rent rates are much more realistic. That's what you'll commonly meet in the market. It's a much more competitive rent rate. Now, the HUD rent rates of $1,400 to $2,300 are based on about 2 to 3 bedroom apartments. And again, many of the applicants had not only, for example, Bob Smith listed on the eviction, but also 2 other individuals who are over 18 involved in the eviction. This does not include children. So again, you might have 2 individuals listed on the evictions. They might have 2 or 3 children also involved in the housing situation. So again, I mean, most of the applicants I found were paying much higher rents, were renting about 2 to 3 bedroom properties or anything. And again, I found that these kind of trends or anything, paying higher rents, having large occupancies, also being a woman and needing the extra space. I'm a single mother, I have two children, I need more space, so I'm prompted to pay more for rent or anything. Thus, it creates a trend where it puts a financial burden on the mother to keep up that rent rate. Now, also, what about the evictions themselves or anything? Now, prior to filing an eviction, there are 3 notice types. There's what's called a notice to perform. That's for a breach of contract. You've broken some kind of rule, you're smoking on the premises, you're making noise, whatever, and that's kind of a warning. There's also what's called a notice to pay rent or quit. You haven't paid rent and, pretty straightforward. There's also a form called a notice to quit. This is for very extreme situations. You're selling drugs on the property, you're fighting. These are notices that are given prior to filing an eviction. So for example, if you haven't paid your rent, you're given a notice to pay rent or quit for 3 days. If you pay your rent, case closed. If not, it becomes an eviction. 75% of these notices are for non-payments or anything. And that's, it's across the board or anything. You find it in the literature. I mean, even when I was calculating the data itself or anything, non-payments were just very recurring. About 22% of them were for unknown reasons or for perform or quit. And that could be for a variety of reasons or anything. It could be, I just didn't get along with the landlord. It was my fault. I was making noise. I was breaking some of the covenants of the contract. So about almost a quarter of the applicants were brought to court for that reason. 1.9% were for notice to quit. Notices to quit, has to be done with the support of a lawyer. Because again, you're saying that this person is selling drugs or they're fighting. I need to get them out in 3 days' time. Normally in the state of California, it takes about 30 to 60 days to terminate a contract. But for a very extreme situation, such as fighting or selling drugs, you can do it as quick as 3 days, provided that you have a lawyer's assistance, provided that you have sufficient evidence proving that you're selling drugs, you're fighting, whatever the situation is to prompt that notice to quit. Now, at the time of these evictions or anything, we found that 58% of the evictions resulted in possession of units. That's the usual outcome of an eviction case. I'm a landlord, I took you to court, I got possession of my unit, you're out of there, case closed. About 38% of them were for possession and monetary compensation. So that the landlords got possession of their units as well as compensation for back rent or for damages on the property. Very rarely or anything, when you see or anything, a landlord or anything, get nothing in the case or anything. I mean, you're either going to get possession of the unit or possession and money or anything. And this really plays to the argument that the legal system is really leaning towards the landlord or anything in terms of advocacy. Now, there is, in doing my study or anything, I found disproportionately that the legal system or anything is really stacked against tenants or anything. Less often they have legal representation. The court cases themselves are about 30 to 40 seconds, literally anything. You go in there, you state your case, it's kind of thumbs up or thumbs down, you're out of there, next case or anything. Disproportionately, landlords or anything show up with their lawyers or anything. Tenants disproportionately show up by themselves. They don't show up or anything, and very few of them show up with lawyers or anything. Now, this is something I should have mentioned earlier and everything, but what about the debt held by these individuals? How much debt or anything are these individuals holding prior to going to court or anything? Well, about 30% of the debt was between $1,000 to $10,000, and about 38% of the debt was between $11,000 and $35,000 or anything. So we found a pretty wide distribution of debt or anything, for these applicants. Most of the debt comes from what I call miscellaneous debt or anything. Not student loans, not medical bills, not credit cards, although they are there. Most times it's going to be court cases, tax liens, child support payments, miscellaneous debt or anything. Disproportionately makes up the majority of their debt or anything of these applicants in my sample. Now, looking at Latinos or anything, I want to kind of give a little caveat here. Based on the applicant's name or anything, for example, Juan Rodriguez, Maria Lopez, for example, I identify these applicants as Latino. So again, that is, I guess, the standard that I'm using to identify somebody as Latino. And based on that measure or anything, I found that 31% of my sample or anything, were Latinos. And 44% of them or anything were paying between $1,900 and $2,300 a month or anything, or rather held debt between $1,900 and $2,300. And they're paying rent or anything of about anything $2,300 and more on average or anything. Now, some factors behind this or anything, I found that the Latinos or anything really had less debt or anything. They had much stronger social networks in terms of, hey, I have a family, you have a family, let's kind of shack up together, we contribute to the rent or anything. But disproportionately, I found many Latino women or anything significantly were showing up in this sample or anything. So again, it's kind of an interesting trend or anything. Now, I did 2 chi-square tests or anything on this sample or anything. One chi-square result was pretty straightforward. The positive correlation between age and the amount of rent that you pay. The older you are, the more rent you pay. It's pretty straightforward or anything. You have a larger family, you have greater expenses, you're making more money, you're paying more rent or anything. But between age and depth and age and gender, very little correlation. I mean, whether you're a male or female, whether you're old or young or anything, I mean, debt distribution is going to be pretty much across the board and everything. I didn't really find a situation where, okay, women have, the debt of women is much higher than men, so this is a contributing factor. Or younger people have lower or higher debt, so this is a factor of influencing that. Not so or anything. You could be young, you could be old, you could be male or female. Debt is across the board and everything. It really wasn't singling one person out or anything. Now, as I mentioned, I've worked in the rental housing industry for about 13 years or anything, and there's this debate that's going on in the industry based on one hand, the right to housing versus property rights. Very often I hear developers, property managers, property owners say that, hey, I feel that the system is stacked against me. I feel that they believe that people have a right to property. And and me as a renter, I hear this on a daily basis as a renter or anything. On the other hand, there was a company called Acacia Consultants, and they studied how do you resolve evictions, or rather, how do you deal with this or anything. And their answer was pretty straightforward. I have a saying that the best sociology is very obvious or anything, or rather, it reveals the obvious. It found that people with drug problems, with substance abuse problems, and so forth or anything, eviction intervention or anything, really does little for them or anything. You can help them with a security deposit, help them with their belongings or anything, but the underlying problem or anything will promote them, or rather push them into a further eviction, or rather a future eviction. But for everyone else or anything, I'm a working person, I might have hit a hard patch in my life or anything. The immediate responses: help me provide security deposit, help me find a new place or anything, help me to find a place to put my belongings. That's what people need across the board or anything. Those things will help us in the room or anything with an eviction. But for someone with a substance abuse problem, or with other emotional problems, or even familial issues, these things are really going to perpetuate that pattern for them. Now, as I mentioned, in the coming years, finding affordable housing will become much more challenging. I'm from the city of Long Beach, and in the city of Long Beach, they give tax credits to new developments. For example, if you're a new developer, we'll give you tax credits if you set aside 25 to 30% of your housing for low-income tenants. Many developers have kind of bitten at this incentive, but on the other hand, many of the new properties that are being built are much higher of value. Many people, I guess, as a legacy of the housing bubble, believe that if I'm going to get back into the housing industry, I'm going to go for the higher value properties. People who are higher income, properties that have a greater return on my investment. At the same time, there's this pool of properties that remain, the properties that probably we're accustomed to, competitive rents, lower rents or anything, you know, that's a limited supply. So imagine this or anything, if these chairs were low-income properties or properties built before 1978, these properties are limited or anything, you know. The new properties being added are much higher value, so we're all competing for the chairs in the room. Once that's sucked up, these much higher value properties are going to be the only option out there. And that's what I guess I mean by the new market and everything. The available housing and everything, you know, the housing that's more affordable, that's for mothers, for minorities, for the young or anything, this housing or anything will be much more limited and everything. And our only options will be higher value properties. Now, as I mentioned, this is a continuing study, and I'm really working on two hypotheses. One, I believe that a preponderance of social factors associated with an eviction, for example, you being a woman, you being Latino or African American, you having low income, these things by themselves or anything, you know, will not contribute to you having an eviction, but one on top of the other anything will increase the pressure on that. And conversely, you really can't single out certain factors. You really can't say, well, it's debt, or it is, you know, the amount of rent that you're paying, or it's the size of your family, but it's a combination of these factors which really increase your chances of experiencing an eviction. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
So we're going to continue through the talks and then have a collaborative discussion and then continue. So please record your questions and comments, and we'll make plenty of time to have a larger discussion. So next, Corina Diaz. Corina is also, as I mentioned, a master's student of sociology at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Her research interest focuses primarily on poverty and inequality. She is currently working on a journal article containing qualitative research data that analyzes the factors that relate to illegal dumping in an area of high concentration of poverty in the city of Long Beach. She is also working on a thesis for her master's about the perceptions of chronic homelessness in the city of Long Beach as well, and that's what she's presenting from today. Her talk is here, Borrowed Space, Perceptions of Chronic Homelessness in Long Beach. Corina.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And today I'm very happy to be here because I'm very passionate about this topic, having to be one of the persons who live in that area, and to see the interactions between not only the homeless population but also the community. And this study was actually inspired by the scenes of chronic homeless people that I encounter every day when I drive through the 710 freeway, and also through walking and driving on the streets of my city. And I became interested on that, and I started doing research, and I found that the city of Long Beach has a 10-year plan that is supposed to end the issue. So the first things that came out to my mind were, well, are we supposed to really say how realistic it is for us to say, or for them to say, we're going to end the issue when we have all these economic things going on, and rent is increasing, as we've heard, as we have all these challenges. So I started questioning that and pulling out some information from the city plan. And what I found is that the data reveals that we have over 4,000 people who are homeless right now, and out of those 4,000 people, over 1,000 people are chronically homeless. And the data also indicates that there are systemic causes about the chronic homelessness, and that is poverty since 1995, the loss of jobs in the city, but I think that's over across the board in the United States. And also the increase of cost of housing, medical care, and also the basic needs. And because of these, it indicates really, another thing that I found is that about 92,000 people, or from a population that's a little under 500,000, is a huge number that are at risk of becoming homeless at any given time. And some of the action steps that the city is addressing to try to fix the issue or eliminate the issue are assisting people who are at risk of becoming homeless, promoting advocacy on behalf of homeless persons so they can be granted permanent housing, including the community so that way they can establish a leadership committee conducting a community education initiative, and developing new funding resources, which I think is one of the main motivators, because they get huge amounts of money that get pulled into housing, and what ends up happening is that all these corporations come and take a piece of the slice. And when I was looking at the data, I found that a lot of, like, you have a building that has 20 units and only like 5 will be like for low-income families. So, and at the same time, you have these corporations really pocketing all the money. So I took those action steps to develop a study that will investigate the perceptions of chronic homelessness in the city, and I found that many of the agencies already do a lot of work that they go out and outreach to homeless people on the streets. So I wanted to take the perception of the community to investigate how will that affect, what if we pull the community into fixing the issue. And with that, I pulled in the main factors that could affect their perception, and I have 5 of them. And the first one is the level of measuring the level of awareness about chronic homelessness, the stigma in relation to apathy towards chronic homeless people, the perceptions of the community involvement, the perceptions about community and city performance about their efforts to ameliorate the issue, and the dissemination of information about chronic homelessness to, so that way they have this thing where they say we're going to outreach to the community, so I wanted to see how they disseminate that information, so that way the community is aware of what's going on. So that's my number 5. So this research study was designed on class rather than race, because despite the differences on race, I wanted to blur race from this study, because the people who I see outside, they're white, they're Asian, it doesn't matter. I think it's a critical condition on which no one is immune from this. And it will be a reason for us to also pull out some of your opinions about it, because how will we be, if we erase race from everything, how will that contribute to the issue of not only homelessness, but anything else that's going on? Class became very important in this study because census data shows that the average household in the city earns about $52,000 a year. But there was a study that was conducted by the city, and they came out that it will actually take 125 hours of work a week for a person to be able to afford a 2-bedroom house. And it really impacted me the way how this is, because a 2-bedroom house, who can live on a 2-bedroom house? Is a family with 2 children, and that's how you start having like a lot of people like clumping together into apartments, because its rent is just too expensive. So I will go now a little bit about the methodology. I used survey research for this study, and I developed a questionnaire with 27 questions that had the 5 main factors. And I used a non-probability sampling because my resources were really limited. And how I did it is, I didn't have the budget to really send those massive emails, but I pulled out a map of the city of Long Beach, and I went out to 32 public places in all parts of Long Beach to try to outreach. And some of the things that to eliminate the bias and to try to get diversity on my study, I approached anybody. Like if I went to a laundromat, everyone who was in that area, I asked them if they wanted to do the survey. So I did it in public places like laundromats, bus stops, parks, and at the mall, and walkways, and it worked pretty well. Some people were more responsive than others, but I think that I got like a pretty diverse opinions from the community. Now, for the levels of awareness that I decide within a survey, I have the health and safety, and so health and safety is a big important thing that affects the perceptions of chronic homelessness, because if the residents are not able to identify some of the health issues and safety issues, how will they be able to identify and report such things? And the city of Long Beach, they say that emergency medical and psychiatric response of the city of chronic homeless people contribute a lot to the social issues that are going on in the city. And most of the prominent infectious diseases that can be spread to the community. You have respiratory infections such as tuberculosis, HIV, hepatitis B and C, skin infections caused by parasites, and also trench fever. Economic issues are also linked to the perceptions of chronic homelessness because you include your taxes that you pay to the city and you want accountability. How is this issue, are any of my tax dollars helping to solve this issue? And among the most important are services provided through correction facilities, services provided through medical providers, the negative economic impact on tourism. And this is a big one because before the Grand Prix, I don't know if you guys ever heard of that, I used to see that all the tents and everybody, all the chronic homeless people on the 710. So when the Grand Prix is gonna come, then they spray them off and then put them out. And they go into hiding through that event, and they already know that they're not supposed to be outside. So tourism is one of the main things. And also the deterioration of infrastructure, because as they set up their little tents and everything, they leave a lot of trash behind them. And the economic issues are linked to the political issues because there's a lot of criminalization of chronic homeless people. And you have that dynamic on which people get criminalized for petty crimes, and you're just thinking about, well, they just try to survive. If they go and steal anything, you have many dynamics going on. Some people use it for drugs, so we have to be realistic. Some people have addictions, but others are just doing it because they just try to survive and make it through the day. Chronic homeless people get penalized for littering, panhandling, vandalizing property, and they get either cited and they cannot afford to pay those citations, and they end up being arrested and put in jail. All of these issues are important, and they link into the stigma towards chronic homeless people. So in these surveys, there was a connection incorporated to measure apathy against chronic homeless people, because one of the things that I investigated was healthcare providers, because they do utilize a lot of the health services that are given to the city, such as emergency response. And I found that 38.8% of the hospital, people who work at the hospitals are actual residents of the city of Long Beach as well. So there's a dynamic as to if they have this perception of chronic homelessness, it affects how they come out of the hospital from their work, and they go out and talk to their friends and members of the community, and it can come out as a stigma. So the community as a whole can be reflected through the experience of disrespect and dehumanizing service practices that allows the stigma among chronic homeless people to increase, taking away of minimizing the issue, because if they feel stigmatized, they feel dehumanized, it's going to prevent them from going to get the services that they need. Some of the factors influencing homeless people to accept or reject those services is some of the things that I found in my literature review is that they experience long waiting periods of time on which people didn't care if they were just there. Interacting with healthcare providers was very unpleasant. The shelter personnel engaged lacking coercive methods for distributing services, and they experience objectification, infantilization that increase the forms of authority and experiences of disrespect towards them. And because all of these factors are pulled into the perceptions of chronic homelessness, we have public opinion. And that's what I'm trying to do with my thesis, pulling in all the issues that affect, the factors that affect the perceptions of chronic homelessness from the community, and how public opinion actually forms to the point where it can influence whether or not these people are going to get the services they need. When homeless people report that the public do not even acknowledge them as people, the act increase exclusion and also invisibility, and we get that when people just drive by and we don't care, right? I've seen this lady for a little over a year. She's an elderly woman, and I always see her in the night when I'm coming from school. And what she does is that she sits on a chair, and she has like this, it looks like a poncho, and she just throw the poncho over her head, and she just goes like this, and that's how she's been sleeping over a year. And it's been an issue where not only members of the community go by and see these, and it's almost like she's invisible. Police officers, as another thing, they just go by, and she's just there, been there for over a year. And that's another of the things that I'm pulling into my thesis also. Because when these people disconnect from society, you have that disconnection. So it doesn't matter what you say to them, they're so disconnected to the point where they just gonna refuse the services, but at the same time, it will be very hard to outreach to them to try to get them out of the situation. And if we pull that up with the 92,000 people that are about to get there, it's a pretty scary thing when you see the large scale of what it could turn into. So to wrap it up, the results of this research study indicate that there's definitely an increase of chronic homelessness in the city, and the perceptions of chronic homelessness is something that needs to be investigated further and taken very much seriously. There is a need to increase awareness and also to support advocacy for community involvement through service, prevention, and also effective practices that will allow effective dissemination of information about the chronic homelessness issue in the city. And this morning I was thinking, because I recently got an email where it said the city won this award for disseminating information through email. But while I was out there doing my research and I was talking to members of the community, I found that these people are very poor, and a lot of them don't even have a computer, access to the internet. And when I did ask the question of have you ever been approached about chronic homelessness and what to do in a situation if you were about to lose your home, they're like, no, like only 3 people said, yes, I've heard something. And it's further study because, it's seed for further research studies, but I wanted to mention it here because there is so much interaction and so many things going on, from globalization to stratification of all of us. And I've seen people losing everything overnight, so I think the perceptions of the community about the issue is very important. So thank you very much for your time, and I also welcome your questions at the end.
So I'm going to offer a last piece, reflections on imprisonment, and then we'll have a collective conversation about race and space across these papers, and then open it up for a collective conversation with all of you. As I mentioned, my name is Jeff Middlebrook. I teach in the Sociology department at Cal State Dominguez Hills. My work currently is really interested in the intersections of race, prison, and music, particularly attention to sound. I've done work on social movements as well. But my approach is really multidisciplinary. I'm interested in asking a question and following that question across disciplinary boundaries. It takes me into sociology, history, anthropology, or in this case, cultural studies or music studies. And I'll talk a little bit today on the current book project I'm working on called Prison Music, Containment, Escape, and the Sound of America. Another project I'm working on is about race and social movements in particular, and I'm thinking about, and the title of that working title is Organizing Race, Anti-Racist Activism and Multiracial Movement Making in the U.S. I think I spoke from part of that last year. Today I'm going to read, a portion of my talk today is called The Sound of the Police, Listening to Criminal Justice. So, I guess I should say just off the top, I'm always curious about how we approach collecting data and how a method can really shape what we find. As a criminologist, I'm used to reading a lot of statistics about data, who's in prison, who's not, what that means, and but at the same time I'm teaching at Cal State Dominguez Hills, which I don't know if you know the area, but it's feeder areas from high schools and community colleges, the Inglewood area, Compton area, disproportionately Black Latino, disproportionately low income. And many of these students in class, when we talk about policing, I'll say, how many of you are from neighborhoods that are heavily policed? It's like 90% of the students. And what I'm hearing is they start to tell stories, and I ask, well, does that create safety for you? Is that justice? And I hear the opposite of what I find in many criminology work, that there's no stories. They just the stats. So what about the voices behind it? So it got me really attuned to this idea of sound, and what does it mean to listen to what we're calling criminal justice. So we look at some of the stats. In 2008, the Pew Center reported that the U.S. has more than 1 in every 100 people are in prison or jail. The stats go as high as 3 in every 100 residents of the U.S. if you consider people under probation or parole. If you take it globally, we're looking at the #1 incarcerating state in the world. So we are #1, at least at that. I think military as well. If you look at prison spending, it outpaces higher education spending by almost 5% currently. And at the same time, images and sounds of prison are used as modes of entertainment. This is what really struck me. Students who are in criminal justice classes, trained to be COs, police officers, maybe judges or law clerks, lawyers, then go home and watch shows like Cops, Law and Order, CSI, then listen to music that may discuss prison themes. Pretty much the plot of every major Hollywood action film is you're either the criminal is the hero increasingly, or they're being chased. So it's about imprisonment and policing. So clearly prison is popular in the U.S., not just in the building of prisons, but as a cultural force. It actually so saturates a U.S. culture, prison and jails, they are virtually invisible and audible, sometimes in plain sight, in earshot. An example here is the Twin Towers jail. I don't know if you've been to downtown Los Angeles, but it's one of the largest and most notorious for a CO on inmate violence in the United States, and it blends in with the horizon, the skyline in downtown Los Angeles. And at the same time, we have prisons largely built outside of cities, so they're integrating into the landscape as well as being invisible unless you have family or friends or you're touched by prison in some way. And then U.S. prison themes are increasingly exported internationally, not just through our media, but by way of military prisons and detention centers. In addition to that, prison is big business in the U.S. I heard you say earlier, Vern, about private prisons now on the uptake. 10% of prisons nationally are privatized. Juvenile detention is 40%. I couldn't believe that looking at that. So there's you can literally buy stocks in guaranteeing that prison beds are filled. And to the point they made earlier, right, if they're not filled, the state pays anyway. Great deal for taxpayers. I'm saying that satirically, ironically. The point is that it's normal to see and hear prison in the U.S., either from outside or inside prison walls. I'm arguing we live in a prison state, even a prison culture. So what might it mean to consider prison in the U.S. not really as contradictory to the values or beliefs of U.S. democracy, equality, or freedom, but a necessary component of freedom? In other words, we determine who's free by determining who's not free. And if you look at forms of mass incarceration, from slavery to conflict lease system, work farms to the modern-day mass incarceration system, it seems to be that it's a reference point for who, increasingly it's a reference point for who is free are those who are not incarcerated. That's increasingly becoming a smaller and smaller number. So indeed, prison culture in the U.S. exceeds far beyond prison walls, through the walls of entertainment, politics, economics, the walls of our collective living rooms, and I'm really thinking about sound here. It's part of the rhythm and the background for the song we call America. What I wanted to do was just sketch out a little bit, I guess, shop the book project to all of you and get your thoughts on it. Like, what am I missing? Probably a lot, but I want to get a sense of how you might listen or suggestions you might make for it. And some of the questions I guided, and I just give you some sense for the sort of guiding where my thinking is currently. So I was really sitting with this question: why is prison so popular in the United States? And not just in the building. And many scholars have written on this in terms of politics and economics and the origin points of America. In genocide, slavery, exploitation, colonialism, empire, prison incarceration has been a tool of a white supremacist capitalism of empire building. It's institutionalized in forms of the military, police, reservations, jails, detention centers, prisons. So certainly the building of prisons, but then this other piece of the culture, like Michelle Alexander and Jim Crow talks about the importance of consensus building to build prisons. In other words, getting the general public to buy in, where tough on crime makes you feel safer. As long as, I guess, the police aren't regularly in your neighborhood. So this disconnect also between the ways that communities experience policing and or vote for it. So if we call the United States a prison state, I'm calling this states of prison. Or in other words, I was remembering a physics class, water being in a gaseous state, like air vapor, water vapor, and then a solid state when it's frozen, and then a liquid state. What might we think about prison is in multiple states? The way that we hear prison or watch prison or vote, it produces the actual form of what we might understand as the prison state itself. So it's immaterial as well as a material concept. I argue that these states or forms of prison in American culture really act as the soundtrack, the backdrop, the congealing that allows prison themselves to come from. Raymond Williams talks about this idea of structures of feeling. So I think, like, what does prison feel like? What does it sound like? And if we were to assess the popularity of prison in the U.S., we'd say, well, it sounds and feels seemingly good enough to allow it to continue to occur, to remain unquestioned on a popular level. So you might think of the United States then as the United Carceral States, united in our view of incarceration, at least on the policy and electoral politics level. But as scholars increasingly recognize, criminal justice in the U.S. is not always and increasingly less often compatible with social justice, even with in communities, even with what's termed democracy, freedom, or citizenship. These institutional projects of incarceration really have congealed around mechanisms that I mentioned of imprisonment, like slavery, like chain gangs, work farms, detention centers, jails, prisons. This is the structure from which the feeling has proceeded. We just want to sketch through, and then I'll wrap up some of the I guess they call them chapters in a book. I think some sort of areas of thinking that I'm working through that I want to talk to you about and see your thoughts. I'm trying to theorize about what it really means to listen to the sound of the police. I don't know if you know this song by KRS-One. Yeah. The chorus actually makes the sound. Whoop, whoop. That's the sound of the police. And to me, it's really interesting if you follow rap music, and this is when I first was attuned to it, how pervasive the sound of policing and imprisonment is within rap music. Either sounds being made by the vocalist, or now increasingly soundtracks, ideas like you hear police sirens or helicopters, and it becomes this background that really is a similar background noise if you're in communities that are heavily policed. I don't know if you've lived in those communities. In South LA, where I used to live, I now live in Long Beach. It was a regular backdrop. It was a helicopter, and it's like, oh, this is what rappers I was listening to from South Central Los Angeles were talking about, which I didn't have I only had a reference point, but again, I had a reference point not being there. I heard it through records from Minnesota, where I grew up. So I was very familiar with the sound before I was familiar with the experience. So this first chapter, I'm really trying to theorize, what does it mean to listen to prison music as a way to understand imprisonment. When I say prison music, I mean prison that is from prison or about prison, or signals it. I start here with the Star Spangled Banner as an example of a prison song. Don't know if you guys know that, but it was written in the bottom of a boat in detention by Francis Scott Key in the Atlantic. And then I referenced, well, the history of popular music in America was also largely begun by people of African descent in detention in the bottom of the boat in the Atlantic. So this is ways to really think about imprisonment as even the anthem we sing about freedom is very much tied to this experience of detention and imprisonment from the jump. And it's sung regularly, but not referenced as a prison song. So what does it mean to think about it in that context? The following 4 chapters, I'm trying to sketch really a history of prison in the United States through the sound of it. So through music, as well as to see where and when the prison system and the culture systems overlay and overlap. So the second chapter I'm thinking about is I call the sound of containment. I'm looking at chain gangs, work songs, and the blues. Some anthropologists among Gellert, Lomax, Oster, and Jackson have spent time from the early 1900s to about the 50s or 60s going into work farms, largely in the South, and recording inmates, largely black male inmates, singing songs, work songs, and recording them, but they haven't been considered or analyzed as a way to think about necessarily prison resistance. It's been more of a slice of time and saying, listen to the sound of it, but beyond it being analyzed as a particular critique or what prison does to bodies of people. You can literally hear bodies laboring and breaking down within the prison system. And here I draw from sound studies and sound theory to think about the grain of the voice, what is pain or hope sound like. So not only what structures sound like, but what's the possibility. So in there you find escape, and this is where I'm in the title of the book, Prison Music, Containment, Escape, and the Sound of America. I'm arguing that sound, even though it's contained within a prison space, escapes perhaps before physical bodies do. In other words, we hear the sounds, sometimes via record or film or television, before that person is free. So how might we think about that as the possibilities there for theorizing around what the U.S. could be alternatively in relation to freedom? The chapter 3, I'm thinking about this, now focusing on the sound of escape. In this chapter, I'm thinking about prison concerts and country, folk, and rock music. So the history of jail songs in country, really drawn from the blues, and then the history, I think primarily of one gentleman, Johnny Cash, who literally, and this was an interesting kind of double thing, we've talked about it a little bit when Oliver and I were shopping some of these ideas around. I don't know if you guys know Johnny Cash, but he was a famous prison concerts, like in San Quentin, which is in the Bay Area, not far from here. You can actually watch it on DVD. But he wrote a song to the inmates in San Quentin, specifically for it, and performed for him. He got a standing ovation. He had to redo the song. Prison guards were really upset because he talked about burning the walls of the prison down while he was inside of it. And I don't want to romanticize what that means, but I think there's something interesting about it in terms of crossing walls in terms of discussing freedom. For a moment, Johnny Cash is inside with the prisoners, but then he can leave, and then he can't. And there's this interesting, I think, racial component to it, that he called himself the Man in Black, and he chose the color black as sort of the symbol for resistance, and he talked about that. But I don't know if he located it in terms of African resistance to similar systems of incarceration. So I want to sort of open up possibilities for that. People like Joan Baez and B.B. King also have done concerts in prison, and I want to think through the limits and the possibilities of listening to prisoners, and what does it mean to have that cultural exchange across prison walls. This connects, of course, to prison's resistance and rebellion movements from places like Attica, as well as current hunger strikes that have come from Pelican Bay, Cochrane, even offshore in Guantanamo, which I don't know if you guys know, but as prison programs are being cut for education and even physical health. So as there's limitations on prisoners allowing their minds and bodies to stay healthy, resistance, we're living in a hunger strike resistance moment. So you can take my mind or my body, but I want to take my right to eat. But what's deep is that, I don't know if you've seen this recently, the U.S. State Department has actually force-fed Guantanamo detainees. Mos Def famously allowed Guardian reporters to demonstrate that on a YouTube video. It's pretty hard to watch, but if you're interested, you can type in Mos Def force feeding. It's hip-hop. And he wanted to show people how the government is keeping people alive, not allowing them to resist by choosing death to make a statement about the lack of freedom and incarceration. So I think we're in a really interesting moment to theorize about the possibilities of containment and escape. This fourth chapter, I'm taking it more into the current moment. Rockefeller drug laws, the Reagan era, the rise of the prison industrial complex. Ironically, at the same time, hip-hop arrives. Two very different answers for low-income communities and possibilities, particularly communities of color and low-income communities. But there I'm thinking and connecting ideas of COINTELPRO, if you know the history of the counterintelligence programs on liberation movements, black and brown liberation movements, American Indian liberation movements, Asian American issues, and then the policing of hip-hop. Don't know if you know this, but in New York and Miami in particular, within the gang unit, there's actually detectives that are...
I just watched that.
Hip-hop cops, yeah. There's actually detectives whose job is to follow police officers. So there's a conflation of art and criminality.
They say it's supposed to be protection.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about it, definitely. But just the stigmatization of entire art coming from communities of color, black communities in particular, as being criminalized I haven't heard that they have rock police yet, or country police. And, they should have had it with Johnny Cash, he was a badass. This last chapter, and this wraps up just my portion here, is I want to theorize around the end of containment or escape. I'm drawing here from people like Angela Davis, Dr. Ruth Gilmore, who talk about the possibility of abolition. What does it mean to revive notions of abolitionism, to abolish prison, or the idea of imprisonment as an answer to social ills, or as the consistent default to solve issues of homelessness, poverty, immigration. Increasingly, prison is the go-to, apparently, policy decision. And I focus here on the rise in detainment, not only for undocumented immigrants, but for suspected terrorists in the years after 9/11. And there's an interesting conflation of immigration customs enforcement underneath the Department of Homeland Security, which suggests that undocumented immigrants are threats to national security in terms of how they space there. But the space of detention and the moment of detention, I could say that we're in, it's neither prison or not prison. It's neither freedom nor unfreedom. It's this weird space where you are detained for an indefinite amount of time, sometimes with no charges, sometimes in very harsh conditions. And so what does it mean that at the moment people are claiming abolition or rejecting the idea of prison as solving social ills, detention and detainment, this limbo space of containment becomes very popular. And there I try to really follow spoken word as a sonic corollary. In other words, spoken word as neither music nor just words, sort of an in-between space. And it's interesting that that is what's available for many prisoners to articulate their words. So there was poetry coming out of Guantanamo Bay that a lot of the lawyers collected, spoken word poetry that talked about the struggle to commit suicide, the difficulty of it, but also thinking about what's the possibility for hope of eliminating carceral space, not only out there, but maybe in here. So that's my talk, and we'll have a collective discussion.